Hi, Sarah.
Hey, Michael, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Sounds like we both were spared the ravages of Hurricane Irene, so that's good. We feel lucky.
Yes.
Um, so I'm Sarah Posner. I'm a senior editor at Religion Dispatches, and I'm here with Michael Brendan Dougherty of the American Conservative, who has the cover story. Is that correct?
It's not the cover story.
Well, a really great feature on Jon Huntsman in this month's issue of the magazine. And
Thank you.
I wanted to just start off with that because I think it provides a lot of insights into Huntsman that I think a lot of people aren't aware of, but also it provides a really good backdrop for talking about the other candidates.
Right.
If I can, I wanted to read a quote that just jumped out at me from your piece.
Sure.
And you write,
Cool.
In Jon Huntsman's America, once a child survives the first trimester, he's well on his way to having a rifle in his small hands and extra money in his pockets. If this qualifies as moderate, why be conservative?
Yeah.
So I think a good chunk of your piece goes to exploding the myth that Huntsman is the moderate in the GOP field.
Yeah, I mean, he is and he isn't, right? So,
right.
His record in Utah, as governor of Utah, is very conservative. And he was
on certain things, on abortion in particular, guns, and slashing taxes.
Yeah, and those were the three issues. You know, as I think I said in the piece, that in the past 2 decades, a moderate Republican is someone who disagrees with conservatives on abortion, guns, and taxes. And Jon Huntsman's record isn't just conservative, it's actually to the right of most conservatives on those issues. And that's partly a function of being in Utah and having
a very conservative state, yes.
Yeah, that will pass these bills. But he signed them, and he was popular enough to avoid signing them if he didn't want them crossing his desk in the first place.
But do you think he's more conservative on abortion than the other candidates? Because when I was reading your piece and its discussion of the abortion bans that he signed into law as governor of Utah, they sounded very, except for there's one that made one bill that became law, made a third trimester abortion a third-degree felony for the doctor. Is that right? Yeah, I guess that was the one that jumped out at me as possibly being more. But in other respects, his record sounded a lot like, say, Tim Pawlenty's.
No, it does. It's just a thing is that when, especially in the past 2 weeks, or really since actually I turned the piece in, where Huntsman even more has been portrayed in the media and portraying himself as a moderate, as pro-science, a lot of his new admirers really don't have an idea of how conservative he is. And a lot of conservatives who are dismissing him as, oh, this guy should be running in the Democratic Party. I wanted to explode the idea that somehow Jon Huntsman was a Democrat in all but name. And his record, I think, really bears that out.
Well, as you point out in the piece, he doesn't really, his demeanor or his delivery or his vision almost doesn't really jive with the Tea Party moment.
Right, and there's something about him where he's never been interested in appealing to movement conservatism, right? He doesn't do little junkets with National Review and pitch himself to their editors or to Heritage or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Because for most of his career, being Jon Huntsman in Utah was enough. He didn't have to do those things.
Right, exactly. Well, yeah, that's a big part of it. I also got the very strong sense that it's not in his personality, that he really doesn't, he doesn't see himself as alienated. He doesn't see his philosophy as an insurgent philosophy or insurgent movement in American politics.
He doesn't have a list of grievances against secularism and the separation of church and state and, environmentalists who are ruining America. I mean, it seems like if you read Rick Perry or you listen to Michelle Bachmann, there are grievances against those things. And Huntsman, in my observation of him, and also from reading your piece, doesn't subscribe to that sort of approach.
Right. And frankly, I have to make a confession. I didn't go into this assignment thinking I would like Jon Huntsman all that much. And normally I go into an assignment where I profile a candidate like him, and I come out liking them less than when I went in. So my expectations were really low. And after doing the piece, I was enormously impressed. Now, I'm the type that, in the last election cycles and rhetorically, I basically have been a Ron Paul guy because of foreign policy. And that's also, Huntsman has been, in a less radical way, distinguishing himself on foreign policy rather than being like Ron Paul and denouncing America's foreign policy in strictly moral terms. He does it in the language of a realist as opposed to a neoconservative. And he does it very strongly. And I just came away enormously impressed with a guy who could hold himself a little bit aloof from the scrum of conservative movement politics, and yet still have these core convictions, still express them, and still, as I said, he made the words conservative and moderate seem like they could be compatible again, which they haven't been for some time.
Well, conservative on certain things and moderate on other things.
And also just the confidence, in a way I see, and I think his candidacy is a reflection of it, I see the zealousness, or the zealotry of the conservative movement in some ways as a sign of ideological insecurity. And I like that Huntsman seems secure in his thought. It seems to make actually his conservative convictions stronger. That he feels like he can announce them, he can sit down at a table and negotiate, and that it's not a politics of, it's not populist in any way. It seems drained.
Well, I mean, he didn't come from any sort of populist background at all. I mean, you describe his father's business background. He comes from a very privileged.
Right. Yeah, his father definitely was. When Huntsman was born, they were still very much middle class. His father was, an executive at a successful egg company in California.
Right.
But as Jon Huntsman Jr. grew up as a teenager and went into college, his father became, one of the wealthiest men in the world.
In part owing to creating the box that Big Macs are served in.
Right. And also, his father, after doing that, created a chemical company that is really one of the biggest on the planet. So but, there was something about him that I thought was really compelling. And it's funny, he's been getting derided for getting all of this positive media coverage.
The fawning profiles of Huntsman, that's probably the adjective that's used the most.
And there are, and I tried to avoid it, so I didn't drool over how good looking his family is.
You mentioned it, though.
Yeah, but there was some, I mentioned it on Twitter and joked about it too. But, for some people there were like paragraphs about his hair and how Kennedy-esque. And in Vogue, I think they looked really good being photographed by Annie Leibovitz. But
I wanted to go back to the point you were making about how he hasn't engaged the conservative infrastructure, or how'd you put it just a minute ago? The scrum, that he doesn't cozy up to the National Review editors or the Heritage Foundation, and he doesn't go to the right conferences and hobnob with the right conservative movement types. Wouldn't that prevent a Republican from getting the nomination? Don't you need, from a, just a political standpoint, would you need to do that to win the nomination? What do you think is up to here? I
don't know. It's weird. Obviously John McCain was slowly becoming a devil figure among the conservative movement.
That's true.
In 2008. And if you look at it, the only insurgent conservative candidacy that ever won was Barry Goldwater. He won the nomination and then was utterly crushed. And since then, by the time someone becomes the nominee, they're seen as an establishment candidate. Even Reagan was seen as that. And I felt like with Huntsman, I'm going to be pilloried for saying this, but I felt like with Huntsman we had a Reagan-like figure in that he was conservative, but he could appeal to the center in a very big way. And in fact, he has a much more conservative record on abortion than Reagan did going in to 1980.
Although it wasn't, there hadn't yet been such a push at the state level to restrict access to abortion back then, as there has been over the past, say, decade.
Right, but I mean, Reagan as governor actually expanded access to abortion in California. And, and actually, oddly enough, just a historical note, he was encouraged by conservatives to do that when conservatism felt a little bit more libertarian.
Right.
But it was, I thought it was interesting, though, that I go into this as someone who's, at the American Conservative. Pat Buchanan founded the magazine, somewhat hard right, seeming Ron Paul fan, and then suddenly I'm most impressed with the least movement conservative, the moderate, the so-called moderate. And I think it's sad in a way that he's been labeled as a moderate, and I think it is his campaign's fault, too. I mean, they could be putting this out there in the conservative press a lot more than they are, and then be able to plausibly make an argument that, hey, you can vote for us in good conscience, and then we're going to go in and whip Obama in the general.
Well, let's talk about his conservative heresies, shall we say? His support for civil unions.
Yeah.
Which the other the other leading candidates are signing the National Organization for Marriage's marriage pledge. So they're taking the hard line anti-gay marriage stance, and in addition to supporting civil unions, I don't really detect any of the otherwise opposition to gay rights as an infringement on Christians' religious freedom, the way that a lot of conservatives have framed, say, the Employment Non-Discrimination Act or hate crimes legislation that includes protections for people victimized by hate crimes motivated by sexual orientation. So he hasn't, he doesn't really engage in that, and he has explicitly supported civil unions. His tweet a couple of weeks ago about global warming, I mean, how many, that really caused a stir. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but it was something like, call me crazy, but I do believe that global warming is created, man-made or created by humans.
Yeah.
Was it global warming or was it evolution? He said
his tweet was, I believe in evolution, and I trust scientists on global warming.
That's it.
Call me crazy.
Right.
Yeah. So the two things, I'll take them in that order.
And also immigration, but you can take these.
Yeah, I'll take those in order. So on civil unions, that's very interesting because so Salt Lake City wanted to give benefits to same-sex partners of city employees, and he got out of the way. And
Salt Lake City being kind of more of a liberal enclave in Utah than other parts of the state.
And he expressed a belief that civil unions are a good idea, although he's, like Barack Obama, he says marriage is between a man and a woman. So,
although that isn't always what Barack Obama said.
Right. What's interesting to me is that Huntsman in the debates framed it as an issue of equality, which is not the language that conservatives who do endorse civil unions typically use for it. They typically use it as, they say that, it's freedom, people should be free to do this, free to make these arrangements. And that he phrased it in equality, I thought was telling, that his views on marriage are actually more liberal than libertarian.
Right.
If you can describe it that way.
It's more of a equal protection kind of argument than it is an argument that, people should be free to do whatever they want.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then on the global warming, that's interesting too because what I find interesting is that it reveals that the right, broadly, thinks that the only indicator that a politician won't let environmentalists or who they think are alarmists write our economic or industrial policy is if they deny that global warming is real, right? So so in a way, like the base voters and even somewhat of the conservative media basically take global warming denialism as a signal of being free market, right? And Huntsman actually makes the distinction saying, okay, the science, I trust the science behind global warming, but still believe that the people should make policy and that it shouldn't just be turned over to the most alarmed experts. And in Utah, he regularly, he believes in preservation. He's praised the creation of the EPA, but he would regularly fight on the side of business against the Interior Department in order to keep Utah's economy, which is very heavily tilted toward the energy industry.
Okay, so what you're saying is the tweet notwithstanding, he's still fairly conservative on environmental
policy-wise,
regulation.
he's conservative, but he doesn't take this step of saying. I think most people who deny global warming on the right, deny the science of it, I think really that's signaling. I think they're just signaling that I'm not going to let environmentalists write our economic policy or rewrite our economic policies.
I think they don't want to have an environmental policy.
Right. No, I think
they don't want to have environmental regulation. I'm sorry.
I think he would significantly move toward the center on those issues, but I do think that there's just this distinction that is lost on the right where they say, they think that if we say we agree with the science of global warming, that means that Al Gore gets a free hand to end the Industrial Revolution and return us to, pasture farming economy, or something like that.
But really?
No, I'm saying that's the level of alarmism. I mean, that's far out, but I'm saying that's the feeling is that if we acknowledge the science, then somehow we're giving permission to the most extreme environmentalist activists to write our industrial policy.
Are you saying you agree with this view, or you're just reflecting?
Oh, I'm just announcing what the view is. No, I fall more with Huntsman, where I think scientific consensus is good enough to trust. I don't think it's infallible, because it changes and it moves.
On which? On evolution or global warming?
Yeah, I just trust science. I think the scientific method has proven itself and been honed over centuries, and the literature seems solid, and so I trust the science, but I do believe that policymaking is a different realm than science. So science, just because one scientist says, okay, these are the conclusions going forward, doesn't mean the scientist can say, okay, now no one should be allowed, X amount of carbon emissions.
Right, but our environmental policy has always been based on, the conclusions made by scientists about certain things, whether it was the, Clean Water Act or Clean Air Act or all of these environmental statutes and regulations were based on scientific studies. But it wasn't necessarily the scientists saying, you must do this or the world is going to end, but it was definitely, many environmental regulations are based on sort of a cost-benefit analysis of, don't do this, will it cause this much environmental harm?
That's what I think they should be based on, is cost-benefit analysis, something that's consistent with our laws, our Constitution, etc. A political process.
Right, but some of the presidential candidates don't want to have any environmental regulation at all. I mean, Michelle Bachmann has said that she wants to get rid of the EPA.
Right, no, I agree.
So if you look at her and Huntsman, there is this huge gap, and I think that it's not just explained by, she's anti-regulation and he is more of a pragmatist on regulation. I think it's in part explained by, he believes in evolution, he trusts scientists on global warming, and she comes at it from this, biblical worldview that, environmentalism is one of these bad isms like feminism and secularism that are at odds with a Christian nation and at odds with freedom. So
I think that's all true.
Yeah.
I think that's all true, but I think my point before is that for the base Republican voter, I do think there are a lot of people who just take global warming denialism as the only reliable signal that someone will be pro-market in their policies. And
so they've never even opened up the possibility of listening to Huntsman on global warming and acknowledging that he might still be protective of businesses, even though...
I don't know if they'll get that far. I don't know if his candidacy will get that far. I hope it does.
Right,
but
right.
They might do that.
Well,
I'm just saying it's become this kind of signal. Global warming denialism has become this kind of signal to people that, I will not hand over the free market, lock, stock, and barrel to someone else. And, there is, and I do believe this, there is some alarmism among environmental activists that, we are at the point of, almost at the point of no return. Millions of people are going to die in short order.
But already people are talking about, were the consequences of Irene exacerbated by global warming, or was Irene's strength?
Right, and I think that those two sides actually mirror each other. I think the kind of looking to the weather for signs of man's iniquity is actually present on both the right and the left.
Well, we know which side Michelle Bachmann came from on that, because she's,
right.
She wondered if this was, God telling America that the government is spending too much.
Right.
And, but I don't know. I mean, I do think that there is enough scientific discussion about the impact of global warming on catastrophic weather that it's something that we should be talking about. I mean, I do think that scientists, there was a piece in the Times this weekend that, as Irene was taking aim at New York, that sort of acknowledged that there are some scientists who think that, yes, this is a factor, not the only factor. It's not the only reason why Irene was so huge and so severe, but that it's something that we should not ignore. So I don't know that I would call that alarmism as much as this is something that we shouldn't just dismiss.
Well, there are ways of there are more sophisticated and less sophisticated ways of putting it, right? So you can imagine, a street-level activist coming out there and saying that, 20 people died in Irene because of, our oil economy and our and your bad behavior, and put it in just stark moralistic terms.
The difference being that those street-level activists don't get echoed by the Democratic candidates, and their analog on the right that does get echoed by the Republican candidates, right? So you have candidates like Perry and Bachmann taking this sort of extreme, creationism and environmentalism, and evolution are taught alongside each other and should be taught alongside each other, and this dismissal of global warming. Whereas I think that the Democratic candidates take more of the, let's try to do this cap and trade, maybe. You see what I'm saying? So I think that Huntsman is, really kind of doing something that seems like shooting himself in the foot, politically speaking, because I think the base, voters in the early states have been so acclimated, no pun intended, to this sort of science denialism that, do you think he's taking on this losing a battle or losing approach to trying to get them to talk rationally about environmental issues?
I'm not convinced it's losing necessarily. I'm not convinced that this is the reason why he's losing.
Oh, no, but I'm just talking about getting Republicans and conservatives to even talk about environmental regulation in this way.
Maybe. I don't think he has an agenda for, using his candidacy to influence. I think he wants to win, and I think this is just who he is. But I don't think it's proved yet that his approach is a loser, just because the Republicans, these are still the same voters largely who went for John McCain. They went for George W. Bush, who portrayed himself as a compassionate conservative and pragmatic. They went for his father, who is much more like Jon Huntsman today. So I would wait to say that the party's been given over to the fruits and the nuts just yet. There were fruits and nuts in the 88 primary, in the 92 primary. They were out there. I feel like we often treat the Republican Party like it is some newly evolved mutant.
I know. That's really funny to me.
Right. When it's largely the same voters from a few years ago, and we do it constantly. I guess it's just the search for the new.
Well, I think it's the search for the new, but it's also that the Tea Party, both in its grassroots and its astroturf form, have succeeded in getting so much media attention, and attention as being the force that is compelling the Republican Party to move to the right.
Right.
And so I think, and because traditionally the evangelicals have been a huge force in the Iowa caucuses and in the South Carolina primary, and so I think people are looking at Huntsman's candidacy through that prism, and while he might have some success in New Hampshire, I think the question is, can he carry that success beyond New Hampshire, where there are more religious voters who have more of a hard line on these issues that we just talked about than he has, and that for whom his hardline anti-abortion rights positions and policies as governor of Utah won't be sufficient to overcome those other things.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's funny. South Carolina as this third crucible is such an interesting place because it's assumed to have this religious right dominance, I think, just because it's South Carolina. But in reality, it's South Carolina killed Buchanan's campaigns for Bush. It killed Huckabee and Romney for McCain.
But I think that it killed Huckabee because of some vote splitting among different evangelical factions. And so I think that's why it's important for either Bachman or Perry to win, for them to really consolidate that base and not split it with the other candidate, or not have it split three ways with some candidate and have a fourth candidate come out the winner, which was McCain in 2008, after the evangelical vote was split three ways among Romney, Thompson, and Huckabee. In fact,
Right.
when I was in Iowa for the straw poll, I talked to a Perry supporter who said that was Perry's. I sat next to this Perry supporter and watched Perry's speech at Red State announcing his candidacy in a tent in Ames. And this Perry supporter sitting next to me said the reason why he's going to South Carolina is because of what happened to Huckabee in 2008, where that vote got split that way and McCain emerged the winner. I think it is heavily evangelical. It's obvious that the evangelicals in South Carolina don't all vote for the same candidate in the primary.
Right. No, that's true. It's just that the history has always been, it's always come out whether the vote was split or not for the establishment candidate. And so I'm waiting to see. And I feel like the machinery is already turning in South Carolina towards guys even like Huntsman. I mean, the Attorney General in South Carolina just today endorsed Huntsman. So I don't know. There's something down there. It'll be interesting to see where the Sanford, Haley people.
Nobody wants Mark Sanford's endorsement, do they?
I think they do.
Really?
He's still very popular down there.
Oh, interesting.
And I think he's going to run for Senate, and I think he will win.
Really? Okay.
Yeah, I do. That's just a side note. Maybe not for another day.
Okay, I wanted to touch on one more thing with Huntsman, but then
Sure.
let's talk about Perry and Bachman for a little bit. And the religious their religious background and the things they read and study and have been influenced by. The other thing about Huntsman in your piece that really struck me was how he was careful to point out that he's not an isolationist, so he doesn't want to be pegged as the Ron Paul isolationist type. But he basically is talking about the end of empire, the end of the American empire, which to me was just a really surprising thing for a Republican to be talking about in light of the fixation with American exceptionalism and all of that. It really struck me, and maybe that's because he's not hanging out, with the Heritage Foundation folks, like you said earlier.
I was amazed. Right? Like, that was my favorite part of the piece, because I was amazed that I got that out of him. I was amazed
can I read a quote from you? He said, our diminished leverage in the international marketplace is because of our weak core here at home.
Mm-hmm. It's funny in a way, right? Just think of it this way. The only Republican candidate who served in the military and the only one who served in the diplomatic corps are the only two candidates who are for rolling back overseas bases and for, talking about empire.
You're talking about Paul and
Huntsman.
Wait, no, didn't Rick Perry serve in the Air Force?
What? Yeah.
Yeah.
Paul was in the Air Force, and
but so was Rick Perry, right?
Oh yeah. I'm sorry, this was before Rick Perry entered in. That line struck me. But Paul Huntsman is a realist, and I think he was partly influenced by the kind of realist consensus that came out of our Asia policy in the 70s and early 80s. And I think that's kind of stuck with him, although I think he's even taken it a step further, because people like Kissinger are still pretty hawkish around the globe, whereas Huntsman has talked about getting out of Afghanistan faster than Obama wants to, and looking at overseas bases and looking to close some of them, and as he says over and over again, rebuilding our core at home. But it was very interesting that he brought up the word empire, which I wasn't expecting him to do.
Right.
And very telling. And to me, very delightful to hear that. Him being critical.
But it may be delightful to you, right? But it was, I just thought when I saw him use the word empire and talk about the end of empire, the only thing I could think of was just the countless times I've heard the other candidates talking about American exceptionalism and America as the Christian nation that is the beacon to the world and the shining city on the hill, and all of this rhetoric that we've become accustomed to with the shall we say the Christian nation Republican candidates. He's setting himself apart from those candidates, not just in terms of this realist foreign policy view that he has, but I think he's quite clearly saying, look, you people, get over this Christian nation American exceptionalism business.
Yeah, I mean, I think he'd still say that we are a Judeo-Christian nation, that we're part of a civilization that was shaped by Judaism and Christianity. I think he would say that.
Really?
Yeah, I think in that bare way, yeah, of course. I think that's kind of I don't know. I think that's so obvious as to be undeniable, that we're still shaped by that. I mean, even Nietzsche could affirm it. I mean, it's... But I do think, but I don't think he's into this, as you're pointing out, which I want to distinguish from what I just said.
Okay.
This kind of ideologized Christian nation.
The David Barton sort of school.
Right.
Yeah. Christian nation mythology.
Right. No. And I think it reflects his background, which is in the world of diplomacy, which he's been in since the early 80s.
Right.
Rather than in the hothouse of domestic Republican politics and conservative movement ideology. I mean, the ideas about American empire are not common to anyone but Republican partisans and think tankers. And that's why you have, in the Bush administration, there were these special, the Office of Special Plans or whatever, that would affect policy in a neoconservative direction. It wasn't like it was something that influenced our entire diplomatic corps or anything else. And you even saw in the Arab Spring, you saw that this, or even WikiLeaks showed that our State Department still mostly spoke like realists in their communications with Arab countries. So, yeah, I think if you want realism, Huntsman is a great candidate. If you want, if you believe that realism has been corrupted, that the State Department is a bad shop for creating American foreign policy, then choose another candidate like Perry or Bachmann. But he's out of step because I don't think he was part of that culture that talks about that stuff.
Right, and let's talk about that for a minute. So Bachmann comes more than any of the other candidates, really comes out of that culture. Her legal education at Oral Roberts, her having been steeped in the biblical worldview, ideology of Summit Ministries and David Noble. And so it's really part of who she is, this idea that America is a Christian nation and it must be governed by this biblical worldview that's in conflict with secularism and other religions, Islam, paganism, these other, isms that are Marxism and socialism, which I think really informed some of her rhetoric, or a lot of her rhetoric, about the healthcare reform bill and so on. And then, so I think that, so Huntsman's almost like the anti-Bachmann in that regard. He hasn't been steeped in all of that, and so he's free to talk about the end of empire, which, it was just, I keep saying it, but when I read your piece, it just really struck me. And then you have Perry, who I would not characterize like Bachmann, kind of coming out of that education system that has been created by the religious right to create candidates like Bachmann. But he's definitely tuned into it. So there was this piece in Politico today. The headline was, "Is Rick Perry dumb?"
Right.
And anyway, it observed that he was reading a book by Charles Stanley, who's a megachurch, Southern Baptist Convention megachurch pastor in Atlanta, and was a one-time president of the Southern Baptist Convention, and has this TV radio program that's seen all over the country. And I think, I was watching on Twitter, and people were tweeting about the fact that Perry was reading this book, and that it contained these shocking statements like, Christians and Muslims should be converted to Christianity and things like that. I mean, when I read the quotes that like Ryan Lizzo was tweeting some quotes, it's just so standard evangelical fodder that it just seemed funny that people are surprised that Perry is reading such a book. It's the same, it's the same sort of thing that Mike Huckabee would have read or said or written himself in 2008. Why do you think people are surprised? By the emergence of these candidates, particularly Perry and Bachmann now.
I think there was a sort of period of, I don't know, I want to take this back to JFK in a way. After JFK gave his speech, essentially saying that
he wouldn't take marching orders from the Vatican.
I'm not going to take orders from the Vatican. And I think there became this acceptance, even in the press corps for a long time, that most candidates' religion was not all that serious anyway. And, that if you're looking for clues into how Kennedy is going to govern, you wouldn't look to the encyclicals of Leo the 13th and Pius the 10th at the end of the 19th century. That there are no clues to be found. And in Kennedy's case, that's exactly right. Although not entirely right, because, RFK was, aghast at abortion and things like that, too. So, there's an idea that there was this cultural, and then also that the political space was a really polite space. And in fact, that we would all talk about religion in the way that Episcopalians and Congregationalists do. It's sort of like, okay, let's be very polite, no one's really wrong on anything, we're all just being nice here.
Right.
And that was the way American elites talked about religion for a long time. Well, surprise, the 80s and 90s and the 2000s show us that evangelicals are moving more and more of their members, at least as emissaries, if not as like colonizers, into the American elite. And so we have to acknowledge that actually Americans and some people that are aspiring to political power do take their religion seriously.
Right. I mean, would you call, I mean, there's this whole debate now going on, that people who call that dominionism, people who aren't dominionists themselves, critics of dominionism who call that dominionism, are being alarmist. But I mean, that's been what the religious right set out to do, was to train Christian leaders to run for office so that Christians could run the government.
Right. Well, and the thing is, I think anti-dominionists are and they aren't being alarmists. So let me explain. People can read the works of R.J. Rushdoony and others, and I've read. I actually love reading Douglas Wilson, who was involved in a lot of debates with Reconstructionists and these kind of fringe intellectual groups among Christians. And in my teenage years, I spent a lot of time in evangelical churches, mm-hmm. and I spend time in Catholic churches now that are serious about, that talk seriously about public policy in their state or in the nation. And Ross Douthat's column today, which talks a little bit about this, says that these intellectual threads are woven in a very complex way. And I think that's right. Because when you read Rushdoony or some of these other guys, they're very serious about taking power, seizing power, etc., and governing as Christians according to a very certain reading of the Bible. And they use a lot of language about a generation of change or changing
Doug
generation.
Phillips calls it multi-generational faithfulness.
Right.
Howard Phillips' son.
Now, there's a way of talking about this that's very serious in the way of, like, Antonio Gramsci, like, let's have a march through the institutions and let's change. You know what I mean? There's a very serious, extended political effort. But then there's also using the same language, that's the same language of, like, let's be a generation that changes the world. That was the same stuff they used at anti-drug rallies when I was, like, 10 years old. And, like, we're going to be the generation. And the fact is, at the same evangelical church, you have people both using the same language and meaning stuff like, hey, this is a democracy, we're part of this, and let's represent ourselves, and it's just this peppy, nice thing, right? And then you might have another person who's, like, reading R.J. Rushdoony and saying, yes, essentially, let's march through the institutions and transform in a kind of cell-oriented way.
Right. Well, I mean, I think, and I've written probably more words than I should on this topic, but I think that you have to look at the way that people receive that message and interpret it and act it out. One of the ways has been the way the religious right has built political and other institutions over the past 4 decades in order that Christian leaders or Christian beliefs or what have you either take over, start shaping or reshaping certain spheres of influence like government and the law or the media or Hollywood. And they've very deliberately built those institutions. It hasn't been a secret conspiracy. It's been completely out in the open. That's what the Christian Coalition was about. It was about training future leaders to run for school board and run for city council and then eventually run for governor and then eventually run for president. And they created law schools and colleges and universities. You look at Patrick Henry, you look at Regent, you look at Liberty. And the law school that Michelle Bachmann attended, Oral Roberts, which later got absorbed into Regent. And that's, I mean, so that when we have a candidate like Michelle Bachmann, now, 40 years later, so she's 56 or however old she is in her 50s, this should not come as a surprise to us if we've been watching what they've been doing. And like I said, it hasn't been a secret conspiracy. It is what they set out to do.
Right. Well, and the thing is that what you just said could have been said when people were still alarmed about JFK's Catholicism. Because except for that mid-20th century liberal consensus, this is the way politics has always worked. Catholics built Notre Dame in order to compete and get into the American elite that was controlled by WASPs at Harvard and Yale. And there were people saying, there were, on fire for the Catholic faith, Catholic bishops who wanted to convert America with these efforts as well.
Right.
And they gradually become a part, in a way, that quest for power eventually, I think, almost always results in a kind of assimilation where both the institution, like Notre Dame, can invite Barack Obama to speak, despite even bishops protesting it. And then also it inserts more Catholics into the government, guys like Sam Alito and...
well, now, 6 of the 9 Supreme Court justices are Catholic?
Yeah, Justice Roberts. So, and not all of them are uniformly conservative either. So I think that there is an element where I think we're in these kind of heady days of evangelical... I feel... maybe not like it's crested yet, but I feel like we're in these heady days where evangelicals are still in this assertive stage.
But let's talk about what they're being assertive about, and maybe we could use this as a segue to talk about Bill Keller's column in the New York Times, where he argues that the candidates should be asked more in-depth questions about their religious beliefs and how those beliefs would impact their policymaking. I mean, we talked earlier about the Christian nation ideology, the belief that the biblical worldview should be what governs our politics and our laws, rather than secularism, the global warming denialism, the belief that creationism should be taught in public schools, or even the belief that 10 Commandments should be posted in public places, or there should be public school prayer. These are actual things that these evangelical candidates at least say they would like to see, not that the President of the United States gets to decide whether there's prayer in public schools, but you see what I'm saying. This is like the belief system, the agenda, the political agenda that they have convinced their followers is the true political agenda that should be followed or sought.
Well, it's funny because I actually think it's almost the opposite. I think it's the people have convinced the politicians that this is the agenda that will get you elected.
I think it's a little bit of both,
right?
But I think it's a lot of religious leaders who have played a big role in that convincing of both sides.
Right? Yeah. Sure.
So So Keller writes this piece in the Times Magazine, and apparently there's been a lot of discontent among conservatives.
Yeah.
That he's asking for some kind of religious test, or what's the nature of the argument?
Well, there's a lot. So some people are saying, okay, Bill Keller's op-ed is essentially a religious test. Molly Hemingway of Get Religion, basically, she thought it was so ridiculous that she said it actually must be a satire, and kind of went through it line by line on that site. And Ross Douthat brought it up in his column today.
Right.
And I would associate myself with Ross's comments that it's fine to ask about religion. It's going to be asked anyway. How are you religious? How religious are you? What does that mean? What does that mean for you as someone who wants to govern our country? And I think those are all legitimate. I objected to Bill Keller's column because of the tone of paranoia and suspicion in it. Which is the questions themselves that he lists, and they're on the Times Magazine blog too, just in their bare form, are not that objectionable, the ones that he issues to all candidates. But the column itself mentions space aliens, Mormons' temple garments, their underwear, and Trojan horses. And to me, that's just like ridiculous. To me, it's the secularist Glenn Beckism, is that we're just asking questions and we're just drawing connections between what you've read and this disturbing, creeping movement in the United States that is seeking to undermine our Constitution, and it's just. And also,
I think he treated it. I do think he treated it kind of glibly with the references to the Mormon underwear and the space aliens and all that. But I think he has a point. And if he had done it in a more serious way, maybe it would have made the point more potently than he did. And that is, you know, these questions about global warming and you know, going back to the question of empire, you know, do you think that the Christian nation has a duty to vanquish Muslims around the world? I mean, there's all these questions that come out of the ideology that some of the candidates have endorsed, you know, with Michelle Bachmann, you know, endorsing some of the Sharia scare stuff, or, you know, Rick Perry, you know, talking about teaching creationism in Texas. And, you know, so these, I think, if they are going to open that door by trying to appeal to that part of their base by engaging in that kind of rhetoric or making suggestions about what kind of policy they would have based on those religious beliefs, that it's a completely legitimate question to probe with them. What would your policy be on these things, given that you've said X, Y, or Z?
Right, and notably, you know, what's funny is that I agree with that I agree that there could be very productive questions. Where was Christian Zionism on this list? I didn't see it at all. And I think that's a major point of policy.
Yeah, and I think that there are candidates, particularly Perry and Bachmann, who, you know, expressed support for those beliefs.
But that wasn't, anyway, and there are other problems I had with the piece. You know, he identified, I don't know how the New York Times Magazine's fact checkers, who I had the privilege of working with recently, I don't know how they missed that Santorum isn't an evangelical, but it actually is a Catholic. You know, that also undermined it for me a bit. But
did they correct
I agree
that?
There are legitimate questions to ask, and there were legitimate questions to ask of Barack Obama, given his association with his pastor in the last election.
What questions would you have asked?
And, you know, there were articles, but the thing is,
so what questions would you have asked Obama? Because I think Obama, in contrast to Bachmann in particular, who has really gone after religious audiences and religious rhetoric, Obama didn't try to use his relationship with Jeremiah Wright as a campaign thing. In fact, he reached out to more conservative religious leaders during the course of his campaign.
Right. Well, there are a couple of things. One, you know, the journalism suggests that in Chicago, his association with Wright was a political plus. When he was
for local office.
For local office. Two, I think one of the reasons that Bill Keller didn't suggest any questions for Obama is I think that a lot of people in the media, rightly or wrongly, don't think Obama really is religious. I think they think, okay, wink, nod, he used to go to church sometimes, he speaks, you know, he brings up a couple of biblical phrases here or there.
Right.
You know,
somebody told him to say that.
He's liberal, and liberal means essentially secular, at least in all the important ways. So I think that's going on there too. But I think I would have asked, okay, do you agree with this? Do you agree with, you know, goddamn America? I would have brought up a little bit of the black liberation theology that Pastor Wright was steeped in.
But how is the goddamn America different from John Hayes saying that New Orleans got hit with Katrina because they had a gay pride parade? It's the same.
Well, that's
it comes out of
the thing.
Same
is it's the same thing, but it's not treated the same way. It took notoriously 6 months for the New York Times to print goddamn America in the paper, in the newspaper of record.
I just think that Obama used religion completely differently than the Republican candidates do. I mean, because they so clearly tie it more to what their policy beliefs are than Obama ever did. And when Obama tied religion to his policy beliefs, he used it to backpedal on ones that used to be more liberal to make them more conservative. So he used to be for gay marriage, but not so much.
Right, but also the fact is, black liberation theology has just as much to say about politics as R.J. Rushdoony does. In fact,
that's true, but Black liberation theology has not had the same impact on Democratic politics as Rushdoony has had on Republican politics. Because even though, there's not a checklist of things, if you're a follower, this is the things that you have to believe, and, you're a follower of Rushdoony. No, I mean, it's been more of a, his beliefs got massaged and changed, and, people receive them and interpret them in different ways. But the general belief that, government should do limited things and that the church should do more and the family should do more. I mean, there are a lot of overarching concepts that Rushdoony really pushed that have really become part of what the religious right, and to the extent that that's a big base of the Republican Party, is about. So I don't think you can say the same thing about Black liberation theology in the Democratic Party.
But the thing is, those are the same things. I could say that, to volley back, to volley serve, I would say that those things where Rushdoony has been more influential are exactly the things where he's standing on the same ground that most Christian traditions agree on, and that we're going to have influence whether Rushdoony was around to elaborate on them or not. Just as Black liberation theology hasn't had this kind of explicit influence, but in as much as it promotes social justice, economic redistribution, etc., where it's consonant with liberalism, you can draw a line. It says, "Ooh, well, here it is. It's having a little bit of influence." Well, maybe not really. And the thing is,
the social justice movements go back, in liberal theology, go back to much earlier than, say, when the big proponents of Black liberation theology were pushing it, like James Cone and so on.
Right, but the idea that Christians privilege the family goes back, at least to the fourth century.
Right. I mean, of course, Rushdoony had his antecedents too, right? But when you look at the way the religious right has organized its political ideology, you can't help but see how Rushdoony played a role in that. I mean, when you look at there are far right interpretations of it that haven't made their way into Republican politics and are sort of considered maybe the fringe of Republican politics. Say, Howard Phillips' iteration of Rushdoony through the Constitution Party, right? Can you think of there's no political party that really explicitly drew on Black liberation theology.
Right.
So, and Howard Phillips was one of the early architects of the conservative movement.
Encountered Black liberation theology too. But my point is that
there are people who don't have the same political power that white Christians have had too.
Right. So. But I would say that it's worth asking a few questions about. It was worth asking Barack a few questions. And it's worth asking Michelle Bachmann a few questions and Rick Perry a few questions, and those will be asked. But the fact is that Barack Obama, in his career before he ran for president, as senator, and the fact is before in his career at Rick Perry, you can see what they've done in office, and you can get a pretty good idea of how their faith relates to their action. And in the case of Obama, not that serious. It doesn't seem like Black liberation theology has been an abiding obsession of his. And
or so even something that was even on his mind.
Right, and so I thought that it was worth asking questions about, and once you got basically satisfactory answers, put down the Chiron Fox News and stop berating this for a month and a half.
Right.
And they did the same thing with Bill Ayers and others. And similarly with Dominionism, I think it's worth asking a few questions about. I think it's worth, journalism that is educative in nature. But I also don't like the kind of anvil chorus that it reminds me of Glenn Beckism, this kind of conspiracy weaving where, let's take some scary Rushdoony things and say that this other pastor who Perry met and talked with has read Rushdoony and this and that. It's just, I've read all sorts of things.
Yeah, my view is that Perry is, he's playing politics. He's putting together a coalition that will get him the nomination and win him the presidency. Mm-hmm. I don't think he really cares about a lot of this religious rhetoric.
I think you might be right. And I think Bachman, it does come out of this
exactly.
in a very
But I think that
way.
the discussion about Dominionism is one, and like I said, I've argued this over and over again, that it should not be something that during presidential campaign cycles we suddenly act surprised about and try to figure out how close the different candidates are to or have ties to certain people. The reality is that there's a religious political movement in our country which is motivated by these ideas and which has very successfully built a political movement that has trained candidates like Bachman, that has created law firms and law schools that teach law from a completely different point of view than you would get in a secular law school. I mean, I can go on and on with examples, and that I think is what we need to be looking at and reporting on, and I do report on it, but and talking about, as opposed to and understanding how that has impacted our politics and impacted the law and so on.
Yeah, and also how it. I mean, for me, it's also how it won't impact our politics in some ways. I guess because I always associate conservative causes with a kind of
failure.
Failure, yeah.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, because we're probably out of time, but we'll probably talk about this again. But I think that, like, for example, there has been some success at chipping away at church-state separation jurisprudence. It's an important thing. So
yeah, that's an important thing. But also, I mean, if we're talking about a few schools that teach a couple of things, and then a few radicals in these schools that read Rushdoony, right?
It's not. And so it's not so important that they read
Rushdoony, right? The full nightmare scenario.
No,
is people getting stoned.
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about looking at the law from this Christian viewpoint, and that viewpoint is that all the church-state jurisprudence from the 20th century is wrong and anti-God. Right. And that the separation of church and state, therefore, that jurisprudence needs to be overturned. I mean, that's the explicit goal of a group like the Alliance Defense Fund. So that's not a conspiracy theory. That's real. And
no, that's not. But there are, like, people bring up these emotional passages about, like, Rushdoony and people getting stoned in the streets. And I'm sorry, but the majority of evangelical Christians are just as much a part of the culture of divorce, remarriage, contraception, and everything else as most Americans are. And the idea that just because a few of them are, like, radical and right, that means that there's this gigantic army out there in the hinterlands ready to...
I think that focusing too much on the stoning homosexuals stuff distracts people from understanding what is really happening with something like chipping away at the church-state jurisprudence. I mean, I think that is actually happening. It's not actually happening that gay people are going to be stoned, right? But the reality is that, there's still a lot of discrimination against gay people, and a lot of it comes from religious, demonizing of homosexuality. So.
Well, yeah, there's that. And then also, it's funny, in a way, this is the reporting that conservatives in the 20th century didn't do when church-state jurisprudence was changing, and they had no idea why it was changing in the beginning, and they had no idea about what was being taught in actual law schools about it. So, in a way, liberals are doing a much better job now than conservatives did in the 20th century in preserving, the kind of America that they liked back then.
Well, we can hope so, right?
Well, I'm just saying, so there's that.
All right. Well, we've probably gone too far.
It's been fun.
Yes, definitely.
As usual. And I hope to speak to you soon.
Yeah, same. Thanks.
All right. Take care, Sarah.
Bye.